Well, it has been 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. President Trump has said he wants to help bring this war to an end. And there has been a lot of talk about how that should happen. Obviously, a complicated situation. Nobody knows it better here at CBN than CBN's George Thomas. And George, thanks for being here to break all this down. And appreciate everyone that's going to be joining this in the chat. I know people will climb in here as soon as we get going. There's already several hundred of you in here. Glad you're here. Put your questions in the chat for George if you got them. I know this is a hot button topic, George. This is over the years. It's sort of evolved. I think some of them have gotten frustrated with the funding to Ukraine, but Trump is in there and he's trying to work this economic deal. Zelensky said he thinks this thing might end. There's hoping it'll end this year. So, I mean, let's talk about this thing. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think obviously there's a lot of focus today being the third-year anniversary since Russia launched its war back in 2022. But let's not forget, Ukrainians will push back and say, hey, excuse me, this just didn't start in 3 years ago. This started way back in 2014. And so let's keep that in mind. I know Ukrainians, this is obviously very close, near and dear to the Ukrainians. But to them, war started back in 2014 when the Russians crossed into the eastern part of the country. And what's so funny, Dan, is that I was in Sevastopol, Crimea, on the exact day that Russian little green men walked into, I'm not quite sure what that is, but little green men walked into Crimea, this strategic military base outpost just adjacent to the southern part of Ukraine. And I was there. In fact, I think I took the last Ukrainian flight out of Sevastopol back to Kyiv, and landed in Kyiv, and breaking news all around the world. Russia had invaded and annexed Crimea, and that began the Russian assault back in 2014 on the eastern part of Ukraine, taking the Donetsk, the Donbas region, eventually Mariupol, and other strategic cities, all the way to their major launch of the war 3 years ago. You know, I had the sense that there would be a major military assault by the Russians leading up to this day 3 years ago. And I had a sense, Dan, I don't know if it's the Lord or just this instinct, that that Russia would invade on February 24th or the 25th. So I went into Ukraine 2 weeks prior to that, and then I booked my return flight back to the US on February 23rd. But lo and behold, the international insurance company that insures all planes around the world sent out the equivalent of a red alert and said that any plane that crosses into Ukrainian airspace would not be insured. And like a domino, all the flights got canceled, including mine. And then I woke up on February 24th at 4 o'clock in the morning in Ukraine with Russian bombs dropping. And I knew I was in the biggest story of my career thus far, and decided to spend the next 3 months literally crisscrossing the length and the breadth of Ukraine, reporting on the massive ground invasion by the Russians. And to imagine 3 years later, Ukraine is still standing, and Moscow's attempt to encircle Kyiv, the capital, within days and decapitate the government of Zelensky, of Volodymyr Zelensky, did not materialize. And 3 years we are here. Ukrainians are looking at the landscape and they're saying, boy, are these days more difficult than what we experienced 3 years ago? And once again, they are in a fight for survival, for the integrity, territorial, and their future, in essence, for future of democracy and future of the sovereignty of their nation.
Yeah, and what do you make of Zelensky's comments, George? Because I mean, this thing, I mean, if we're being honest here, this thing has evolved, right? Like over the years, like, and it's been a weird war, right? Like, I don't know. We've talked about it a lot. Chuck Holton, you guys have both been on as well, talking about this with us. And I mean, it's if Putin proved anything over the last few years, is that Russia's not exactly a competent war-fighting country right here, right? Like you said, they weren't able to do what they set out to do. I mean, you've seen all the clips of them just, almost like haplessly sending these soldiers out to the front line. I mean, I remember seeing one clip, George, where, like an LAV armored type vehicle just dropped these like 4 soldiers off and then just drives away. And there's Ukrainian soldiers just in a trench like 50 feet away, and they just mowed them down. And it's like, what are these guys doing? I mean, so that incompetence kind of showed, but also his willingness to just keep going. But then on the other hand, you have people here in America, at least, frustrated with the money going over to Ukraine. And I know that's kind of like a different, sort of like a political issue, but it does all interplay to what's going on there, because obviously Ukraine relies very heavily on United States support. But
absolutely,
despite the back and forth, George, I mean, Zelensky said there's progress here with Trump, in this economic deal. What do you see going on here right now, and what do you see potentially happening?
Yeah, let me just dig a little deeper into some of the comments, very important comments that you made and observations. The sense 3 years ago when the full-scale invasion took place, it was not the sort of hybrid war with little green Russian men, and they were not wearing insignia. In fact, I remember when I was at the airport in Sevastopol and I looked out my window, I saw these little green men literally coming onto the tarmac. And I said to my producer, who was on the other side, I said, who are these people? Because they were basically storming the runway with no insignia. We all know what American soldiers look like. We know what the British, the French, they all wear with their badges. Well, the Russians, that's why it was a hybrid war. They didn't wear the Russian insignia of the military. So they launched this hybrid war back in 2014. Well, then, 3 years ago, there was this full-scale invasion. Obviously, do you know that today, the 2 countries that have been heavily supporting Russia in an attempt to subdue the Ukrainians have been Iran and North Korea, 2 of our harshest, strongest enemies in the world today. One that is a nuclear-tipped nation, North Korea, another that wants to become a nuclear-tipped nation in Iran. Imagine if you are one of the biggest, strongest military superpowers in the world, i.e. Russia, that you have to rely on the North Koreans and the Iranians to help you subdue the Ukrainians, and after 3 years, you haven't been able to. I was down in the southern part of Ukraine reporting on the so-called Shahed drones that the Iranians have been manufacturing by the thousands, and they've been lethal weapons that the Russians have deployed. And yet today, Ukraine continues to stand. Dan, I have covered pretty much all the wars in the last 30 years, be it Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Lebanon, the last war, Lebanon, Gaza. I have never seen a country that has been singularly united like I have seen in Ukraine. The entire nation, whether they were doctors, carpenters, plumbers, scientists, businessmen, wealthy, poor, it didn't matter. Everybody dropped everything 3 years ago today, and they stood shoulder to shoulder. And Vladimir Putin expected that the Ukrainians would welcome his Russian troops with sweets and chocolates and flowers. Instead, he saw the Ukrainians rise up like no other nation I have seen today in modern century fighting. And what they did, in essence, was deploy a very smart, very calculated, very strategic military offense. Keep in mind, they had very, so to speak, few bullets in the chamber. They didn't have the resources that they did, eventually, slowly from the United States and other European allies. They had to deploy every single person. And I saw it for 3.5 months, crisscrossing the country. They were literally picking up every kind of weapon that they possibly could get a hold of in order to defend their nation. And so today what you see is Zelensky, who President Trump accused of being a dictator. I don't think in the modern era of what we understand a dictator, and we have seen a lot of them from Muammar Gaddafi to Saddam Hussein to Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. Dictators don't like to give up their power. And what has Zelensky said over the weekend? He said, "I'm willing to step down if there is a just peace today in my nation, and that my nation has the opportunity to enter NATO." Is this the sign of a dictator? You would say the opposite of a dictator. He's willing to step down and to relinquish power. And so I think this, again, goes back to this idea that the Ukrainians are united in their territorial integrity and sovereignty of their nation, and they're willing to fight. And, keep in mind, Donald Trump had talked about how Zelensky's approval ratings were pretty much in the doldrums a couple of months ago, and it was true. But once he started to go right after Zelensky and in essence support support Putin and try to sideline the Ukrainians in any kind of negotiation, you saw the nation rally around President Zelensky. And you're going to continue to see that. And they're going to try to negotiate some kind of a deal that brings an end to this conflict. The Ukrainians don't want it. They want to see an end to the conflict, to the human suffering to end, but they want a just peace. And we can talk about some of the guarantees that they want from the United States and the West. But I want to give you that as a context to understand where we are today.
Yeah, well, and Trump is now pushing for this economic deal because he's essentially saying, and the reason why, George, your reaction to, on the NATO front, right? Trump's line has been, and he's right, that America has been funding the lion's share of Europe's defense with the, and I don't have the exact number on here, but a couple, 1.1 trillion, I think, and
it's the lion's share, but
it's half of that.
Yeah, it's pretty close. The Europeans have also been chipping in as well. But it's been, obviously the Ukrainians know they could not have done it without the help of the United States.
Right. So we look at this deal that Trump's trying to make here. We're saying, look, if we're going to continue to help you, I don't think anybody wants to see more Ukrainians dying in this war.
Yeah.
And so we know that they rely on a lot of our weapons to defend themselves. So Trump is saying, listen, what if we, tie this to, I don't know exactly, oil or whatever kind of funds they have going. What if we get some sort of deal here going on where we're not just dumping money into this thing and funding it and getting nothing in return, economically in return. So, but Zelensky said there's progress on that front today after they kind of had that initial back and forth, because the dictator comment from Trump that you mentioned, I think that came after Zelensky kind of lashed out at Trump for what he said was quote unquote Russian propaganda. So, when you do that with Trump, you're going to get some kind of zinger back at you. So he did. But now that he's saying there's progress on this, what do you see going on with this economic deal?
Well, I think, Trump in the sort of art of the deal maneuver, he basically, he shot for the stars, right? And said to Zelensky, listen, the reality is, Dan, Ukraine is sitting on almost 14 trillion. Those are the rough estimates, $14 trillion worth of precious minerals in the country, all the imported minerals that fuel the iPhone and our technology, from EV cars to phones and other, chip making, and the capacity to have the raw materials on that. So in essence, what Trump was saying was like, listen, we gave you upwards of $100 billion or more. We want to make some kind of a deal where we have, at least 50% of the capacity to unearth all of these raw material, and we want to have a long-term relationship. And obviously, Zelensky came back and said, whoa, 50% is too much, and you want us to, you're basically asking us to repay you 3 times the amount of what you gave us. And incidentally, Zelensky said that, listen, our understanding from during the Biden administration was that this was a grant, not necessarily a loan that needed to be repaid. And also a good chunk of that money went to the defense contractors here in the United States to replenish. We basically gave them some of our old military hardware, not really old, but quite a bit, and in essence was replenishing some of that money coming back here to the United States. But this is what we're seeing today is sort of that negotiation. I think what's very important, at least from the United States standpoint, is that, look, let's make a deal with Ukraine to unearth some of these precious raw minerals so that it doesn't, that Ukraine doesn't make a deal with Russia, or that China comes in and makes a deal with the Chinese. So the U.S. clearly has, what Trump is doing is trying to say, hey, listen, as a way of you guys repaying us, let's help you unearth and excavate and mine some of these very important minerals that the U.S. needs, and let's secure a strategic interest in that sense. And I think it looks like obviously the Ukrainians want to make a deal. They would rather make a deal with the United States than with China, North Korea, or the Russians, obviously. But also what is very important in all of this, and this is, I think, what you're going to see play out, is this whole idea of providing a security guarantee, a blanket of security, that if we're going to make an economic deal, we need to also make a military deal so that in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, that the Russian bear known as Vladimir Putin doesn't decide to go on one of his military escapades and decides to again invade and try to take more territory from what it already has, the 20% on the east. And that, I think, is what the United States is right now and Ukraine trying to negotiate, because keep in mind, any kind of military agreement that we make with the Ukrainians, obviously the Russians are not going to be on board with that.
And look, it's the $1 million question right now: is what is Putin's ultimate aim here with all of this stuff? I mean, is it the reunification of the old glory days with the Soviet Union? Like, to your point, like, people are not necessarily trusting that he's going to stop here. But you combine that with what we were talking about earlier, with some of this military incompetence that Russia has shown so far over the last couple of years in Ukraine. But they're still obviously a larger nation than some of those other smaller ones that would be kind of in the hot zone on that. I want to go to the comments here, George. There's a couple questions in there that I want to try to get to. We got people watching online here on the YouTube channel. Appreciate you being here. Thanks for that. This one, let's go to this one first because you got it in first. But Jay Miller asked, do you foresee Doge auditing Ukraine where and how our money was being spent and used? And that's a critique I've seen, George, that, and I don't know that it's necessarily, you can maybe clear this one up. I've heard that, well, it's just, we gave them a blank check and then it went. Talk about that. And then where because Ukraine doesn't exactly have the best history on accounting for some of these funds. There's been corruption over there over the years in the past. So do you foresee potentially an audit coming on that front?
Yeah, I think some of the Russian propaganda has spilled into our mainstream media over the last 3 years. The Russian propaganda is that, in essence, this is a country that was dealing and really failing on the corruption scale around the world, compared to other countries in Europe and the rest of the world. Yes, corruption was a big problem pre 2022, and previous governments, previous Ukrainian governments were trying to, they were in essence fumbling around this whole issue. It was a major issue, not just in the government and even in society, and people were fed up with it. But look, I think Zelensky would absolutely welcome to disprove all the allegations that have been made against his government and his governance in terms of where all the money went to, and Zelensky has pushed back this whole idea that the United States gave north of about $100 billion, and in essence they only got about 60 or 70% of it in terms of actual military assets on the ground. I think Zelensky would definitely welcome any kind of scrutiny to see exactly, and I think in the end it will show that all the money for to a large extent was accounted for, and that it was spent on the things that were needed in order to defend their nation. And so I think it would be great. Why not? I don't think Zelensky has anything to hide from that fact. If it was, he would immediately flee the country, try to make kind of a deal if he knew that this stuff was going to come out, knowing that he may have, allegedly profited from all of this money that taxpayers were giving him. So I think he would welcome that. Absolutely.
All right. Another question here from Judy Thomas. You got a common last name there, George, so I'm assuming this isn't a Judy in your family. But would the USA go in and help rebuild Ukraine as we did other countries after being war-torn? Now, of course, some of those are the ones we went to war with. I'm sure she's referring to like Japan and whatnot, where we were bombing them. So we're not directly necessarily into this one. But I mean, are there any interest? And you were there, George. I mean, like you said, the scale of the war maybe has kind of gone down a little bit. But I want to add to that question.
Yeah.
What is the destruction like there from an infrastructure level? And then back to Judy's point, what role do you think the U.S. will play, if anything, in that going forward under a Trump administration?
Yeah, two great questions. No, the entire country has not been obliterated like the piece of real estate in Gaza that you see. Most of the heavy fighting has been on the eastern side of Ukraine, down into Mariupol, which is obviously in Russian territory, and different parts of the south next to Odessa, some parts of the heartland, and a little bit on the west side close to Lviv. So in terms of rebuilding, I mean, I think the United States can help, but I don't think it'll be a major rebuilding effort like we saw post World War II or Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nowhere near to that level of destruction. Keep in mind, crisscrossing Ukraine since 2014, the Ukrainians have always said to me, please don't send your dear brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers to come and fight on our ground. We don't need your soldiers to come and fight for our land and the territorial integrity, sovereignty of our nation. We can fight on our own. Just give us the weapons and the wherewithal to not just defend our country, but also to launch offensive military operations. That was obviously a very controversial aspect of this whole equation. But the Ukrainians, in fact, when I was down last year, when I was down in the southern Kherson region of southern Ukraine, literally less than a mile away from Russian positions, Ukrainians were trying to get back to some kind of semblance of normalcy, and they were rebuilding their homes. And so I don't think the United States is going to spend a lot of money in terms of major reconstruction across Ukraine. The Ukrainians are more than able to do that, and they are ready to do that, and are already starting to in some of the areas that 3 years ago, like for example, shortly after the massacre just north of Kyiv in a place called Bucha, we remember seeing the atrocities. I was there several days after the city had been liberated from the Russians, and then the atrocities that we read and we reported on. I mean, within a few days, things had been cleared up. I mean, just the mess of all the demolished Russian tanks and so forth. People started picking up. You could hear the hustle and the bustle of reconstruction, rebuilding, cleaning, and so forth. So this is that sort of Ukrainian spirit, and I think we will continue to see that once we see, hopefully, some kind of a peace agreement here.
All right. So George.
Was there another question that was there that I didn't answer?
No. I think you got it. You got it.
Yeah.
So we've got Zelensky, like you said, saying that an end to this potentially this year. That's what he's hoping for. You think that's possible?
Well, I mean, I think it's, I was reading today, I think over the weekend, Trump has deployed his U.S. special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. And what is a little concerning is that over the weekend, he made reference to a 2022 Istanbul protocols that in essence, the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Turks, and a number of other countries came together back in 2022 after the Russians had launched their invasion to try to negotiate, back in March, April of 2022, to negotiate kind of a settlement. And let me just read to you what were some of the demands that the Russians were putting on the Ukrainians. And in essence, what it says is, number one, that Ukraine would have to amend its constitution to remove the clause committing Ukraine to NATO membership. Second, that Ukraine's armed forces were to be capped at 85,000 and restricted to 342 tanks, 519 artillery pieces, and missiles with ranges under 40 kilometers. Second, that the US, UK, China, France, and Russia were to guarantee Ukraine's neutrality, but all parties were to have to agree on a response to any violation, which in essence would be giving Russia the veto over any actions. And then it goes on to this whole idea, but there cannot be any troops, any European troops put on Ukrainian territory and so forth. In essence, what Witkoff made reference to, this Istanbul Protocol, would in essence decapitate Ukraine. I mean, the Russians want Ukraine to cap their military at 85,000, 342 tanks. I mean, this would basically give, if Russia decides to grab more territory, they would just cakewalk over the entire country because they wouldn't have a chance to defend themselves. I think going forward, Zelensky said, I will step down if there is a just peace, and second, that Ukraine has a chance to enter NATO. And I think, this whole idea of drawing down its troop strength and so forth is a non-starter. The legitimacy of Zelensky that Putin wants him to be gone and so forth. Look, the Ukrainians are not just going to pretend that this is not happening and that they just welcome the Russians to invade the entire rest of the country. That is not going to happen. After 3 years and all that they have lost, they are going to negotiate and hopefully negotiate a deal with all parties that guarantees their security in the future. But I'll tell you what, talking to the Ukrainians in the last 2-3 weeks, this is a repeated theme over and over and over again. They do not trust the Russians. They do not trust Vladimir Putin. They don't. And so any kind of peace agreement will not be even worth the piece of paper that it is written on. And unfortunately, they have seen the United States since the late 1990s, since the fall of the Soviet Union, way back to the 1996 Budapest Memorandum, where, people don't realize this. Back before the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine had the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons on the face of this planet. The United States was number 2. Russia was number 2. United States was number 1. Russia was number 2. Ukraine was number 3. And in 1996, the United States, Ukraine, Russia, Great Britain, and other countries signed what they call the Budapest Memorandum that basically guaranteed and said to the Ukrainians, if you give up all of your nuclear weapons, arsenals that are in your possession, we will guarantee the territorial integrity of your country, which had gotten independence from the former Soviet Union. And then we saw what happened in 2014, and then we saw what happened 3 years ago to this date. So the Ukrainians have this sense of betrayal in the back of their mind that any kind of deal that they make with the Russians, they cannot be trusted. And unless the United States and the European allies provide some sense of security blanket, they will never sleep comfortably and at peace, knowing that a Russian bear is right next door and has these aspirations.
CBN's George Thomas with me, CBN's Dan Andros here. And George, appreciate you being here. Before we wrap, do you have any final thoughts on this? I know you're heading out for a trip right now, doing some more reporting. I know you mentioned China earlier. I just want to tell everybody to keep an eye out on CBN for George's reporting from around the globe. I know the stuff you were talking about on China and their aspirations. You mentioned them here, like U.S. trying to get in there with this economic deal to if anything, maybe to stave off China from doing the same, because they are just gobbling up mineral rights all over the globe right now. And obviously they're seen as sort of an adversary to America right now as well. So George doing all kinds of great reporting. Make sure you're checking that out. But George, final thoughts on Ukraine-Russia today?
Yeah, my heart has been, as I have reflected today and just being in the country and what Ukrainians are feeling today. I was so inspired by just the sense of unity that I saw 3 years ago. And even back in 2014, I've made numerous trips to Ukraine since 2014. I've made numerous trips, by the way, to Russia as well. And I've got good friends, very dear friends on the Russian side of the story as well, who are urging and who are praying for peace between these two countries that are related by blood. You know, these are two countries that are related by blood. But as I was reminiscing today, as I woke up this morning and thinking where I was 3 years ago today, I was heartened by the Ukrainian church. You know, they were prepared months before the war started, and all the major leaders of the church in Ukraine, evangelical, Protestant, including Ukrainian Orthodox, they all got together and said, listen, brothers and sisters, if at all Russia were to be invaded, we need to be the hands and feet of Jesus, ready to answer the need and the desperation of our countrymen. And they deployed these warehouses all around Ukraine, stocking them up with water and non-perishable items and so forth. And I saw the church in action, and I have reported on what the church has endured since 2014. And I just want us to remember to pray for the Ukrainian church, because they continue to be on the front lines, literally in the trenches, continue to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to their fellow countrymen, and they continue to pray and to intercede for their nation. And the church is vibrant. The church is absolutely vibrant. It's a growing church, and the Lord is moving in Ukraine today. And so many inspiring stories of just the brave and the heroic acts by countless selfless men. You know, keep in mind, when the war started, the entire country was empty of women and children and the elderly. And I spent 3 months with I call a band of brothers. And I saw these Ukrainian men from the ages of 19 all the way to 70, 75, who were helping total strangers. And today that spirit is still there, and the church continues to minister the good news of Jesus Christ. And keep in mind also, in these territories, we've been reporting on this, I've been reporting on it for quite some time, in the territories that are now held by the Russians, like in Mariupol. I think of Pastor Gennady Makhnenko, whose church was commandeered. He's a very famous evangelical pastor who has been on the front line since 2014. His church was taken over by the Russians. His home was taken over by the Russians in Mariupol. He and so many others continue to minister. But I was going to say, in those territories held by the Russians, like in Donetsk, like in the Luhansk region, in Mariupol, there are Ukrainian believers who are in essence fearing for their life because they're Christians, evangelical Christians. They've been persecuted. Hundreds of churches have been destroyed. Pastors have been arrested, beaten. Some of them have been killed at the hands of Russian soldiers. We need to continue to pray for our brothers and sisters in those territories held by the Russians, and that God would give them the strength, continue to straighten their spine, and give them the spiritual backbone to continue to minister love in the midst of these very difficult situations.
Amen. Good word there, George Thomas from CBN. Appreciate you stopping by here, George, on the YouTube channel for CBN and discussing this and giving people some more context, some more information on it. As always, great stuff. Safe travels to you, sir, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir. Okay, God bless.
All right, George, and God bless all of you watching at home on the YouTube channel. Appreciate you being here. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't done that already to catch all of our reporting on CBN News from a Christian perspective. Appreciate you all being here, and we'll see you next time. God bless.